Now let's take a moment to look at the other side of big business in the Gilded Age, the issues of labor and the beginning of the modern labor movement. If there was one word that defined the Gilded Age for the common worker, that word is inequality. Although the overall standard of living increased for most people during the Gilded Age, the gap between the rich and the poor also increased between 1860 and 1890. Although most were able to move from unskilled labor, and now we're talking about people fresh from Europe, fresh through Ellis Island in New York, move from unskilled labor to skilled labor to professional level jobs over a generation. In fact, professional level jobs would be held by their children. It still remained that the top 10% still controlled 75% of the nation's wealth. It seemed that the gap between the rich and the poor just got wider. The rich got richer, and the poor overall seemed to get poorer. Working conditions in the nation's factories during the Gilded Age were awful by today's standards. Real wages increased in manufacturing between 1860 and 1890, but most people didn't see it. At least they didn't feel like they did. I also add that the average work week for a factory worker in the Gilded Age was 59 hours, with 10 to 12-hour days. The factories maintained poor health and safety conditions. Put bluntly, they were dark, they were crowded, and they were dirty. Later in the Progressive period, we'll talk about the results of having a dark, crowded, and dirty factory. Fact is, during the Gilded Age, people became dependent on the machinery that they used, and they became dependent on distant owners whom they had never met. For the first time in human history, someone, a factory worker, could lose their job based on a decision made by someone at least personally unknown and definitely far away. Just for a good example of this, Andrew Carnegie could be spending summer vacation in one of his many castles in Scotland, and he receives reports that he's losing money at certain plants. All right, decision made. Lieutenants, fire 500 people immediately. And these people didn't know Carnegie. Carnegie didn't know them. And now they've lost their jobs and they lost their livelihoods. It may seem that with conditions like these, it'd be easy to form labor unions, but organizers found it rather difficult to create labor unions. Many workers in the factories were recent immigrants and were children who could not speak for themselves. Civic leaders, local governments, they respected property rights over labor rights. Thus, local governments tended to side with management. Business leaders considered labor to be a commodity, something that could be measured, something that could be purchased and sold. And then you have the workers themselves. At the same time that you've got all this stacked up against the workers and unions, workers who came fresh from the farm tended to have that mindset that we talked about in the New South. They wanted to be self-sufficient. They wanted to own the land that they farmed, or in this case, they wanted to direct themselves. They wanted to order themselves around and not have a manager or a union tell them what to do. Many labor strikes failed in this period because the workers themselves lacked organizing power. Thus, they lacked direction. A common example of a labor strike here in the early labor movement is like this. Something would happen on the factory, the workers would get mad, they walk off the job, they go strike, they'd pick it for a little while, then they degenerate to a mob, and then they go home, or before they go home, they'd stop at the local pub, have some P's and Q's, go home, sleep it off, and they come back the next morning just ready to go to work as if nothing had ever happened. You cannot regain bargaining power if management knows, hey, if we just sit it out for 12 hours, we'll ride it out. The first important union in the United States was the National Labor Union that was created in 1866. The National Labor Union was composed of delegates from labor and reform groups who were simply more interested in politics than improving the workplace. And it's this interest in politics that will be their ultimate downfall. Before their efforts ended, as a result of the economic panic of 1873, and by the way, economic recessions are devastating to labor unions, The National Labor Union was able, before they went away, was able to convince Congress to implement an 8-hour workday for federal employees. Now, all I can say for that is, collectively, let's just all say, wow. Thank you for watching this introduction to Gilded Age labor, and may the force be with you as always.